In the last episode, I was talking about how to work in a negative way with painful states of mind. Working in a negative way means not doing anything, but at the same time, not deliberately not doing either. When we started off talking about the negative paradigm in therapy, I think it's fair to say it comes across as sounding complicated and hard to get to grips with. But once we look into it enough, we get to this stage where actually working in a negative way with painful states of mind is very, very simple, amazingly simple. So just as soon as we're seeing things in the way that I've been describing, it's a question of very great simplicity, and such great simplicity that it's not as if we're going on learning new and new things and improving what we're learning and getting more knowledge. It's just that we have hit upon what it is and we just keep on doing it, or not doing it rather. So any positive type of therapy is by definition complicated. It's complicated because there are right ways to do it and wrong ways to do it. The same as with every method, every single method for anything, from baking scones to extracting aluminium metal from bauxite. There's always a right way and a wrong way. Positive therapy is exactly like this. There's a right way of thinking, a wrong way of thinking, a right way of going about things, or a wrong way of going about things. And this is a burden, because we have to keep this in mind the whole time. What's right and what's wrong. And as I've said before, when we're in the thick of it, when you're actually in the mental pain, this burden can very easily become too much, because it becomes something extra to get right on top of everything else. Whereas if we happen to be sitting comfortably at home with no major mental hassle, it might not seem too difficult. But in the battlefield itself, it's a different question. And the very fact that there's a right way and a wrong way very clearly means that we've been delivered into the territory of the thinking mind. We've been delivered there and dropped off there, and that's what it's all about, because the thinking mind equals right versus wrong, if we were to really simplify things down. So here we are, helpless really, in the domain of the thinking mind, and we're helpless because our only recourse is to get it right and not get it wrong. So we're at the mercy of the game. And the game is deceptive. All games are deceptive. The game of the mind that we're playing, the therapy game, is that if we do something right, we'll be free. Whereas accepting the terms of the thinking mind and playing by these terms is the exact antithesis of freedom. So lack of freedom is the root problem, and we're trying to solve the lack of freedom by handing over all of our freedom to the game, to thought. So not only are methods bothersome in the sense that they weigh upon us and we have to remember them and we have to make sure that we got it right in our heads. They're also bothersome in the sense that they put us wrong right from the very beginning. So in the last episode, I was talking about not breaking everything up into right and wrong, and not narrowing down, focusing our awareness in this way, but rather being aware of everything as it happens. And as it happens means as it happens, not in a right way, or not as it happens in a right way or a wrong way, because that's our projection, but just as it happens. So in other words, we're not splitting everything. We're not breaking the symmetry of the situation and narrowing down. We're staying with our whole attention, not our fragmented or divided attention. And we're staying with our whole attention precisely because we're not buying into this thing of right and wrong, which in Buddhism is sometimes called the sickness of right and wrong. So we haven't been infected with that particular sickness. And so that's why it's so simple, because there is no right and wrong. There is no need to do special things in accordance with whatever situation might arise. All there is awareness. And awareness doesn't involve doing anything particular, it just involves being aware. So when we're aware, what we're aware of, before we go down that road of thinking some things are right and some things are wrong, some things have to be encouraged and other processes have to be discouraged. What we have is a world where there are no right things and wrong things, but what there is, or what we encounter maybe are difficulties. And we're aware of difficulty, we're aware of challenge. So when there is a difficulty, when there is a challenge, we're aware of that difficulty. And we're also aware, because this is the very essence of being aware of what we normally do when we're faced with difficulty, and being very, very clear about how that doesn't help us. So just to go back to the last episode, what we normally do to difficulty, with difficulty, is to fight against it, which narrows us down, and we're playing the game of right and wrong, or ignore it, or repress it, which is playing the game of right and wrong, or take the idea that's coming to us seriously, which means we're not fighting against it, we're not trying to repress it, but we're actually running with it. And that's what's sometimes called acting out. And that's also not, obviously that's not working in a negative way either, that's also falling into the trap. So we're aware that we can either go along with the compulsion that's coming our way, and the reason it's a compulsion is because at the same time a difficulty comes along, we usually almost always experience that as a compulsion to do whatever it takes to get rid of that difficulty. And so the world we live in is a world made up of compulsions of one sort or another, because whenever there is difficulty we're compelled to find an answer to it, which is why it's complicated. Because when we're talking about difficulty in terms of painful mental states, there are no answers really. We might think there is, but that just creates more problems later on, so we're looping and going around and around and around forever. So when we're working negatively with difficult, painful mental states, our awareness is always on the pitfall of either following the compulsion through or trying to resist the compulsion. And so if we're catching it at that early stage, so to speak, there is no compulsion. It's just the difficulty. And we're aware of the difficulty, and we're aware of ourselves habitually or automatically reacting in that difficulty one way or another. And this doesn't work when we just immediately, when we start getting into it, it's not something that we can get the hang of straight away. But when we do, given that it takes a while to get the hang of it, then it's a very, very simple situation. Because every single difficulty that comes along, we're just being aware enough not to fall into a hole, not to get tricked, not to get bamboozled, not to fall into our habitual patterns of fighting or avoidance or gullibility that we usually do. So even as I'm talking about it there, it sounds kind of complicated, but it isn't, because what it really is, staying awake. So there you are. And you've been given the job of staying awake. It's like you're on sentry duty and you're told, look, stay awake. You have to sit there for 6 hours, 8 hours. Don't nod off, don't snooze. Only in this case, staying awake isn't something we do, it's when we remember not to do. Doing, any sort of purposeful doing, is sleeping. We're losing that undivided attention, and we're getting sucked up into a mind-created version of reality, which is based on fragmentation, which is based on seeing things in a very narrow way and not knowing what we've missed out on in order to narrow it down. So we're only really seeing a very distorted version of reality. So we sit there trying to maintain this state of wakefulness, and we keep falling asleep. So that's all it comes down to, really. We keep going back to the old ways, automatically falling into habitual patterns. And then as we continue to practice, we're quicker to spot that we've done this. So the better we get at this, and the more clear our awareness of what the practice involves, the quicker we are to spot ourselves falling asleep. And that means we aren't falling asleep. Momentarily we're starting to snooze, but then we catch ourselves again. So that would be the state of being awake. And what the negative way of working with painful mental states really means staying awake in that particular way. And this, of course, really echoes all the esoteric teachings which exhort us to stay awake. And until we've done the background to know what this means, it is very confusing. It's so confusing that we just give up on it and go for something more intelligible. Once we do understand clearly, then we realize that it is a very, very simple thing to do, but it's not an easy thing to do, but it's extraordinarily simple, because all there ever is watching ourselves and being aware when we fall asleep at the wheel, and getting to grips with how extraordinarily easy it is to fall asleep, and becoming more attuned to the difficulty of the task in that way. So working negatively just means we just keep coming back to it, and then we fall off the wagon, then we come back to it, and we fall off the wagon, and we come back to it again and again and again. So even though it's simple, it's grueling to start off with, because all of our time is spent falling off the wagon. All of our time, we would be tempted to say that all of our time is spent failing. But if we say that we've gone down the wrong road again, because falling asleep, or which really means reacting, isn't failing. Because if we say it is failing, that's a reaction to say that, it's a judgment to say that. It isn't failing, because that's how we learn. So what it is really, it's the arena within which we are learning. The failing is the way in which we learn. It's only by, if I could try not to say failing, it's only by falling off the wagon that we learn. So it's valuable and it's important. It doesn't feel very nice and it's hard work, but that is the essence of the path that we're on, is to notice ourselves drifting, falling asleep, reacting time and time again, and noticing that we're reacting. So that really is the beginning and the end of it. That's just what we do. We just keep coming back and coming back. And there's no question that this is in itself a form of suffering, because it's very hard and it's demoralizing. We want to give up on ourselves, and we have ideas that this is an impossible thing and we're never going to be able to get anywhere with it. So there's all these things going in our head, and possibly we could get frustrated, very possibly we could get frustrated and annoyed with ourselves, or annoyed with the whole business. And there absolutely isn't any feedback so as to let us know, hey, I'm getting great at this is going well, because it's a slow process, it's not a fast process. Gaining freedom from our automatic tendencies is the ultimate of all tasks, really, and it's not fast. So it's not fast enough for us to be able to see that we're improving at the time. So it is suffering, but we could also say that it is the archetypal suffering. It's the suffering of all of us when we are I was going to say fighting against, but that of course gives the wrong idea. But when we are contending, when we're persistently coming back from being unconscious and taking an interest in the fact that we're unconscious and what that means. And so it's meaningful suffering. If we're in a lot of mental pain, the suffering is immense. And so it might be said, I don't want to do this because the suffering is immense. So no thank you. But the only thing about that is, if we try to work unconsciously with suffering, then, as I said in the last episode, that only means one thing, and it means that there's more suffering. So that really isn't a good answer. Even though the suffering is great, we're working with it in the only way, absolutely the only way, that isn't making it worse. And we are making it worse because we aren't adding extra levels of avoidance or self-deception. And so if we have the clarity to see that what we're doing is the only thing that doesn't make it worse, then that's the basic sanity that we need, to realise that, okay, it might be really, really difficult, but we know the alternatives is even more difficult. So if we're clear about that, and what that means is we're not deluding ourselves into thinking that there's a quick fix, some kind of a hack that we can use to exit the suffering in a permanent way. And throughout the course of our lives, we're always deceiving ourselves in this way with regard to the suffering inherent in our mental states or painful mental states. It's the basic fundamental self-deception we're always buying into. And this, of course, brings us back to this very key idea of working negatively. Key idea being that we cannot purposefully escape a painful mental state. That is just sublimely impossible. And that's the really hard thing to learn because we don't like the truth. So instead of learning this, we have all these escapes, which is equating to what I was calling false freedom. And the false freedom always goes around in a loop. It always brings us back to where we started off from. But because we are short-sighted and driven by fear, we'd rather keep on self-deceiving ourselves and going in loops, rather than, which means we never do get away from the painful mental state and we never experience it. And we're always in a state of resistance to it, which means that we're locked into a kind of a stalemate that goes on forever. So this idea of looping forever, thinking we're getting away but not getting away, then realizing later that we're back to square one again, and this going on and forever. And then when we're able to, we fool ourselves yet again that we are getting away from it. Is the ultimate form of suffering, really, which is the form of suffering that we condemn ourselves to by being positive thinkers, by thinking that control is the answer, by thinking that thought can deliver us from the valley of evil. Okay, thanks for watching.